So, Ndu,
Yes.
let me ask you this question. Is Gen Z driving a true Pan-African agenda or revival? Or are they just keyboard warriors waiting to be co-opted?
I think it's necessary for us to really look at how Pan-Africanism has been used in the last, even 10 years ago. It's still very young.
Yeah.
Young in the sense that we left it for a while and then came back and started picking up on it. But it seems to be the buzzword that we kind of just throw into conversations nowadays. After COVID, we used the word pivot a lot. This was coming off of the 10 years of paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And so it seems that now what we are doing is you're using Pan-Africanism. It sounds great and we throw it into any conversation, but do we really know what it means?
We know what we stand for in Panel 54. We're looking at reframing. So that aspect of Pan-Africanism, and if it's coming from a Gen Z perspective, should be the kind of reframing that we're looking to say, this is a pedestal upon which, or this is the foundation upon which we can actually now look at Pan-Africanism, not only as a slogan, but something we can actually contextualize, we can touch, we can feel, we can actually then say, well, we've got something here that we can actually run with. From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru and Ndu.
I'm Ndu.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time, with nuance, with history, and a deliberate commitment to context. This is not punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here.
The Pan-Africanists, the forefathers of Pan-Africanism on the continent, actually all of them, no longer with us today, had something in mind that they wanted for their units, or what we call nation states today, that they wanted for them to thrive. They wanted for them to be led by the rule of law. They wanted for them to be, politically and economically mature. It was the only way then that they would then be able to come together as one body to then be able to stand against what we're already seeing taking place today, which is neocolonialism.
Yes.
I would imagine that they would turn over in their graves if they thought or they saw
where we are
what
now.
We are doing with the phrases that they so eloquently and intelligently coined.
So where do you draw the line then between a movement and a mirage?
It can't just be something that you put up and say, let's look into it and see. And say,
but that's where I'm going.
It's over there.
Yeah, but that's where I'm going with what you just said just now, in the sense that they dreamed this, and unfortunately they passed, and they would never have envisioned where it is.
Or they were killed.
Or they were killed, fine. But was it that it was a movement at the time, in the sense that when it was being coined, when it was being created, it made a lot of sense then. Did it not have the power, or the staying power to say, okay, fine, this has been ingrained? And that's not to say that we will always be able to say, okay, fine, once an idea has been adopted, it will stay there in perpetuity. Obviously, there's external factors that have to be taken into context as well. But I suppose where I'm struggling to see is the disconnect between, okay, fine, people like Muammar Gaddafi, Nkrumah, all these guys had ideas of how Pan-Africanism should work, and they planted the seeds.
Sure they did.
Nobody watered it.
The thing is that they were seers, because if you look across, if you see what was happening with Thomas Sankara in Burkina, if you see what was happening with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and also much later on what happened with Muammar Gaddafi, is that we, in most of these countries, and even with Patrice Lumumba, is that we saw after colonization, these issues started to come about, but they realized that they were seers in their own right.
Yes.
Because they knew that this was the time to plant the seed, but that it was also the time to cultivate it. Because you've just come off of a place where there was horrific conflicts, there was the fight for independence, and then you finally get it. But there was also huge interference, and they saw that.
Yes.
To will these units to not get into this trap of interference. But sadly, in most cases, they were taken out. Okay,
but then back to the original question. Can then we bridge that gap in terms of how we can look at Pan-Africanism using Gen Z as a platform?
Sure, we can. Oftentimes we run away from the responsibility of idealism to say that this is what we should look forward to. And then we say, well, they're too young. There's no leader. There's no vision. How old was Kwame Nkrumah?
30?
He was barely 40 years old.
Yeah.
Thomas Sankara was killed before he was 30. Patrice Lumumba, how old was he? He was not in his 40s when he was assassinated.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a youthful leadership at the time who thought and dreamed and willed that we could be Pan-African. We could be. So there's no difference.
Okay.
We're just running away from the responsibility of idealism in many cases, I believe.
There's examples of actually where Gen Zs have kind of created that aspect of an ideal, a situation where we could go Pan-African. We can actually then use the word Pan-Africanism in the true context of the word Pan-Africanism. And I think that's where we might struggle with the whole idea of trying to say that we can achieve Pan-Africanism. But I still stand by the fact that given our current political class and the fact that we need to start recognizing other political blueprints, other political activists who can actually do it. It doesn't have to necessarily be opposition. I think a good bet would probably be Gen Z, especially showing how their voices are being heard a lot more now. So where do you draw the line then between a movement and a mirage?
It can't just be something that you put up and say, let's look into it and see. And say,
but that's where I'm going.
It's over there.
Yeah, but that's where I'm going with what you just said just now, in the sense that they dreamed this, and unfortunately they passed, and they would never have envisioned where it is.
Or they were killed.
Or they were killed, fine. But was it that it was a movement at the time, in the sense that when it was being coined, when it was being created, it made a lot of sense then. Did it not have the power, or the staying power to say, okay, fine, this has been ingrained? And that's not to say that we will always be able to say, okay, fine, once an idea has been adopted, it will stay there in perpetuity. Obviously, there's external factors that have to be taken into context as well. But I suppose where I'm struggling to see is the disconnect between, okay, fine, people like Muammar Gaddafi, Nkrumah, all these guys had ideas of how Pan-Africanism should work, and they planted the seeds.
Sure they did.
Nobody watered it.
The thing is that they were seers, because if you look across, if you see what was happening with Thomas Sankara in Burkina, if you see what was happening with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and also much later on what happened with Muammar Gaddafi, is that we, in most of these countries, and even with Patrice Lumumba, is that we saw after colonization, these issues started to come about, but they realized, and they were seers in their own right, because they knew that this was the time to plant the seed, but that it was also the time to cultivate it. Because you've just come off of a place where there was horrific conflicts, there was the fight for independence, and then you finally get it. But there was also huge interference, and they saw that.
Yes.
To will these units to not get into this trap of interference. But sadly, in most cases, they were taken out. Okay,
but then back to the original question. Can then we bridge that gap in terms of how we can look at Pan-Africanism using Gen Z as a platform?
Sure, we can. Oftentimes we run away from the responsibility of idealism to say that this is what we should look forward to. And then we say, well, they're too young. There's no leader. There's no vision. How old was Kwame Nkrumah?
30?
He was barely 40 years old.
Yeah.
Thomas Sankara was killed before he was 30. Patrice Lumumba, how old was he? He was not in his 40s when he was assassinated.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a youthful leadership at the time who thought and dreamed and willed that we could be Pan-African. We could be. So there's no difference.
Okay.
We're just running away from the responsibility of idealism in many cases, I believe.
There's examples of actually where Gen Zs have kind of created that aspect of an ideal, a situation where we could go Pan-African. We can actually then use the word Pan-Africanism in the true context of the word Pan-Africanism. And I think that's where we might struggle with the whole idea of trying to say that we can achieve Pan-Africanism. But I still stand by the fact that given our current political class and the fact that we need to start recognizing other political blueprints, other political activists who can actually do it, it doesn't have to necessarily be opposition. I think a good bet would probably be Gen Z, especially showing how their voices are being heard a lot more now. But that's just my take.
And how they're used forms the basis of our conversations today. Pan-Africanism is one that has been on the airwaves of many an African through the last few years. Coming in from 1960, when the calls for the Organization of African Unity, that conversation comes through even in 2025. who will be the one to unite the continent? Today, we speak with Winnie Kabinti, a youth advocate and policy commentator. She's been taking on governance issues and digital activism and has been a vocal participant in civic progress, embodying Gen Z idealism and its urgency. And she joins us on panel 54 today.
Karibu sana. Let me just jump straight into it. If your life was a movie, what would the title be? And what genre would it be?
Fast and Furious. Season 4.
Season 4.
Yeah.
Okay. Fast and Furious Season 4. Okay. And your background?
I'm a journalist and communication specialist, passionate about empowering youth in media and information literacy and championing digital rights.
Okay. Now, from hashtags to the streets, right? Gen Zs across Africa are emerging as generation seemingly unwilling to accept the status quo, right? They've become the continent's most visible dissidents, young, digitally fluent, and globally aware. But for all their boldness one critical question looms, right? Is Gen Z driving the true Pan-African revival, or are they just keyboard crusaders waiting to be co-opted?
So, when we look at the movements that have happened across the continent in the last 3 or so years, are we seeing a movement that is going towards unification of one voice rippling across the continent, or are we seeing that there are different divides and that different needs are being met depending on the country?
I will say it's a mixture of both, because while African youth, whether they're in Kenya, Nigeria, Accra, Dakar, we all share similar challenges: unemployment, poor governance, bad healthcare. But at the end of the day, we also have different levels. So those are some of the challenges that unify us. There's also the demographic, where we share the same number of population, of us being young people. But then there's also different inequalities, different magnitude of inequalities in each country. For example, you look at Nairobi in Kenya, some of the freedoms that we enjoy is not the same thing people in Uganda are enjoying. Talk about digital inclusion, freedom of speech, and those kind of things. Kenyans have gone online. When Uganda is facing internet shutdown, Kenyans are going online and advocating and being the voice for Ugandans in the digital space. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a situation of, am I my brother's keeper?
Absolutely.
So from that perspective, yes, we can see that kind of coming together, right? From that perspective, I'm going to go back in history a bit, but before we do that, I wanted to ask this question, or at least look at this perspective, or give you food for thought. Hashtags and trendings and everything have become the new protest songs, outside of when we actually do go to the streets. I say we as if I'm part of this whole thing. And I ask this question very, very poignantly. Where is the bridge to policy, right? I can hashtag all the way I want, but where's the bridge to policy? Where is my presence as a Gen Z in Parliament, right? I've said this many a time before. We have the rage, but where is the rigor? Yeah, we've got momentum, but no machinery. Basically, yeah, it's easy to go viral, by all means, yeah, but much harder to actually go structural, right? And the problem is that it's not that Gen Z don't lack the heart, right? What I think they lack is a handbook. Here's what. It's not to say take baby steps, this is what you must do, this is how you have to do it, but they're operating from a perspective of a vacuum. We have this momentum, we've done this, then what? So that for me is, while we have the unitedness, I think like I said, we have the heart, but we don't have the handbook.
Absolutely, and that's a very good point. And I think I want to believe it's one of the reasons why I'm a staunch advocate for digital literacy and media and information literacy. And one of the challenges that we see, or rather the gaps that we see, is how is information being delivered? What kind of approaches, angles are we delivering information to young people? So we're saying young people are there, they're digitally connected, they're tech savvy, they're curious, they want to be at the front lines, but also how are we disseminating information with a goal to inform, with a goal to sensitize, with a goal to influence? And I think that's the bit that we need to see a lot of tactics changing, so that we have an appetite of people who want to be involved, to engage, to hold people to account, but how also at the same time are we influencing and disseminating information to these people? And this is where we can now also look at how the media is covering issues. We've seen a situation where top media houses are influenced by governments for obvious reasons, and that takes away the seriousness or the angles, the approaches in how issues are covered. For example, in Kenya, you'll see a lot of political news coverage just take one direction. In some countries, maybe politics is not even discussed to that extent. So how do we have a situation where we are going deep into the issues and building an appetite for interrogating, use leverage on platforms that the youth are in, like TikTok? I've seen, I've forgotten the name of this guy, but there's a guy who just popped once, one time in my feed on Instagram. Sorry, not Instagram, TikTok. And it's a guy who just does news bits, WhatsApp in the news in Sheng and a bit of Swahili, and the guy has massive following. And you can see it's because he's delivering content, digesting it in a way that is understandable, digestible for young people. And I think that's the approach we need to take.
Who would then say, right, I'm offering myself to be in this position? Do we see that? And I think that's the connector here.
Okay.
Why is it difficult to see that?
It is difficult because I think everybody is comfortable in their own corner, doing what works, and only trying to be relevant to get mileage. And I will say this because we saw it, for example, when we have this protest around, whether it's in Nigeria or in Nairobi. That's the time you also get to see certain NGOs being very prominent on the ground. Yeah. That's the time, like, I remember in Kenya, I was like, okay, we've heard about LSK so many times, but this is at the time that I personally saw them at the forefront of being involved with the youth. So how are we also taking that responsibility to enable, to empower? We are talking about young people, majority of them being online, or the digital access being the biggest advantage. But also this also comes with a lot of digital security threats as well.
State surveillance.
Exactly. So we are also not seeing a lot of these agencies, and in this case, we can't leave it to the government because it's also the perpetrator of some of these things. We are not seeing people who are actively coming out, and they have the projects. Like we talk about people in the NGO sectors. How are we also equipping digital activists with the right threats or with the right tools to fight and even understand these threats? And lastly, I also think there's okay, that thought has disappeared. Let's go to the next question.
Something you said about protests. I just want to make a statement as I was doing all my looking at the situation, right? The question was basically, so is Gen Z a movement or mirage? And this is something I've liked going, and I like illustration. So movement or mirage works very nicely for me. And what I noticed was the answer lies in whether this generation can evolve from reactive protests, and that's exactly what you just said, right? To strategic power building, right? From hashtags to policy, from flashpoints to frameworks, from viral to viable. Where's the viability?
The viability, I believe there are different options, but I believe one of the other bigger options is also having the right leaders showing up, putting their hands up, and following this through to the end.
Now, but leaders from which side? The reason I ask this question is because Gen Z is decentralized.
From both sides.
There's no leader, there's no tribe, there's no...
If it's the other, that's the problem. Because if I have a faceless entity, if I'm V for Vendetta, whatever the case may be,
yes,
and the minute egos take over and say, oh, by the way, because I'm the one who sent out the hashtag, perhaps I should be the one who should be. Kind of that ego aspect is human nature.
Absolutely, but I see this leadership in multifaceted ways, and not from the opportunistic base that we've seen. We've seen just people take advantage, and they will always be opportunists. You take up because you want to have a certain political mileage or grow your following, but the kind of leadership that I see that could really make change is first from the movements themselves, where we're living in a society that is very influencer oriented.
Yeah.
And so if we can also have leaders who are showing up, not necessarily to say, yeah, I'm the one, Winnie, going to State House to meet Kasongo and talk about these issues, but I am the person that is embodying the kind of aspirations that young people want to see. The things that we are talking about, how many of these are we seeing just take the stage and influence dialogues in the right way? We are not seeing that. There's also leaders who, not everybody, for example, who is sitting in our current parliaments is a bad person. We have very good leaders who are still in the current leadership regime. And some of them are even youthful, under 35. But also how are they also using their power to align with the needs of the kind of leadership that young people want to see? So I think the leadership cuts across both ways. And then there's also the need to also really ensure that the current rights are also protected, so that intimidation and fear, which the state again uses to weaponize a lot of these movements in different regions, is also like dealt with. Because there's fear first, I think, and we've also seen this with deaths, with people being killed in Nigeria and even here in Kenya. There's fear that comes with now getting back, calling the government to order, and it forces people also to retreat. But I think one of the positive side, as we are seeing, is there's a collective need that we're seeing from African youth. First, they want a sense of strong leadership that is first very bold, one that is cracking down on different injustices. And that's why you saw when Kagame the other day had this diplomatic row with the Belgian government, people were happy. There was, if you see all the conversations on Twitter, everybody was excited. Even people who were not pro-Kagame, they were like, this is the kind of, strong leadership that we need, that is protective of our issues. So I believe when the right leadership shows up, when young people are equipped with the right tools to understand that this is a process, that change will not happen just from one hashtag, but when it becomes a sustained effort, then we get there. Then the other bit is also ensuring, like right now, for example, countries that also don't have a lot of these provisions, like I gave an example of Uganda earlier. I know Ethiopia is also one of them, where even freedom of speech is very restricted. If we are saying the strength of young people is in these devices and just being online, if there's no access, that becomes a challenge. If we are also looking at marginalized youth in the rural area who have no access to internet, they are also left behind when it comes to this conversation. So I think we cannot speak about what the youth movements are capable about without also really talking about these issues that are also curtailing their progress moving forward.
Okay, so is a Pan-Africanism aspect of dream or an actual destiny? And therein lies the other question I want to ask about leadership. If for them, they're going to see that, oh my God, I have sovereignty addiction, in the sense that if we become one unit in Africa, what happens to my empire? And it's not even the country, my empire, because that's the mentality that we're coming from.
That if we rule, if we are in authority, we rule, essentially.
Yes.
If we're in leadership, we rule.
So there's a disconnect between what we want to see. Right? We keep revisiting the dream of a Pan-Africa, but we never wake up in that dream.
Absolutely. And I guess it's a very good question, and it's actually even making me wonder whether the Pan-African dream is even a dream that the current crop of youth even subscribe to. And if at all there's that ideology or perception, what does it mean? And I think that's a good food for thought.
Okay.
That people could actually ask, and what it even means, because we're also dealing with a generation that has different perceptions of what change means to them,
and
what good governance, exactly,
and
but I know one of the things that I can say authoritatively that is a just shared need across the demographics in the region is just that connectivity and accessibility, and this is because of the digital economy. And we are seeing a space where people want to have the rights. We have a lot of digital nomads who are working, because then statistics are showing us that yes, while young people we have a high rate of unemployment, most countries in Africa, a lot of these young people, especially Gen Zs, are also becoming more self-employed or working in the informal sector. So the need for connectivity becomes one of the shared goals in terms of also accessibility in the different countries. Like I can wake up today and decide I want to be in Mozambique and just be positioned there without being subscribed to different barriers just as a foreigner, or even higher taxes and those kind of things. I can say those are some of the things that I think are shared. But in terms of what ideals or what challenges or advantages that young people are seeing when we come to talking Pan-Africanism, I don't think that is a conversation that has been had at that level yet.
So from 1900 to now, it's 125 years. So we're going to have to wait another 125 years before we actually... That will be Gen Z part 2.
For somebody else to be bitten by the bug, essentially. Is that what we are saying?
But I like your honesty. I think, it's a difficult answer to... It's a difficult question to actually answer it in that context.
Do you see there being unity of purpose? I mean, we talk... In order for Pan-Africanism to happen and be practiced in the way in which was originally envisioned is that there would be unity of purpose and that folks would be on the same page, essentially. I think of regional bodies, like the European Union, for example, who've come together, unionized, and they are dealing with one currency. They're dealing with open trade. They're dealing with, safe for the folks who decided to Brexit. But there need to be certain things that you need to have in place in order for you to look at any kind of unification. Before we really talk about Pan-Africanism and coming together, are we ready, really?
I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. And if you look at our respective countries, we don't even have any leader or any president who even shares any ideals or even has interest of building onto the ideals of the previous president.
You're always trying to be a me too. I mean, I'm the new one. Look at me.
Exactly.
I'm brilliant.
Strategize. And that's why it's also become very hard for us to really achieve everything we laid out in our Vision 2030. Because then there isn't a structured way of aspiring, like this is our goal, this is what we are working towards building or towards achieving. And if one country cannot even have that in place, how then does the leader of this country go and convince another leader who has just been elected 2 months ago to also have... So I will say, based on our current leadership models, even our electioneering years and how they are set up, sometimes I feel like I know they're pro-democracy, like after every 5 years we want a new leader, but
we have presidents for life.
But we also...
So my analogy for that is that Pan-African for me, and allow me to be as cynical as I possibly can in my wise old age. Pan-Africanism is like a pan. See what I did there? Without a stove. It's not necessarily a bad thing in the sense that we have stuff in the pan, but we cannot bring it to heat. There's a lot of good ideas we have in general, but we cannot bring it to heat, and that's what, for me, that's my analogy of what Pan-Africanism is at this current point in time anyway.
even as we wrap this up, is there an opportunity for something? I think about the proponents of Pan-Africanism and, an organization of African unity, and, they're no longer with us. If we want to look at Kwame Nkrumah, if we want to look as far as, as recently, and I say this recently because it was quite recent, Muammar Gaddafi, who talked about a unified Africa, but there were certain things that needed to happen. Can we begin to even imagine that in this period, something like that could happen?
No, unless we get an equivalent.
Yeah, I'm going to double down on that one. And in the same token, from that perspective, in terms of looking at whether we can actually then, I want to find out, is the youth represented in Africa Union? Is the youth represented in the Africa Free Trade Area?
Is it?
Do they have veto rights? Are they just being, popped up and say, oh, look, we have the youth in mind, and this person came and gave a wonderful speech, and they're really wonderful. This is at COP20, I think it was COP26, and then nothing happened after that. They're nice to look at, nice to hold, but if it's broken, it's considered sold, kind of thing. Yeah. So that's your double header.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a bit of just ticking that box of the diversity checklist. And I know we have the African Youth Envoy, but then the questions about how this office or this entity is even set up and how they are empowered to even engage from a Pan-African point of view, and also build or rather draw towards certain outcomes, because that could be one of the offices, I believe, that could really try and unify.
That you could run.
Yeah, waiting for the...
that you could sit in the desk behind, for sure.
Yeah, I believe if we start making use of such forums, then it becomes easy to really start putting those ideologies in people's minds as well. Yeah, but I also believe we have current leaders. They might not even be youth. We have a lot of female leadership that is also coming into the picture, and female leadership has been touted to be good for democracy, for change. We also need to see this being coming into play. And when it does, when people see that transformation, when people see that really change, that, oh, you've been advocating for female leadership, this is actually the change that it's injecting, it becomes very easy to rally people even to some of these ideas and some of these causes. But if it's going to really still be business as usual, we have a crop of female leadership and all they're bringing to the office is even a shame both to the agenda and to the office, then it becomes really hard to rally people around that. And that's why even the issues around gender equity are facing very many obstacles, because of, first, already there's the systematic issues, but also considering that we are living in a very patriarchal societies, the stakes become even higher if we have the examples of female leadership that are also betraying the cause.
I was going to say, they're being co-opted into, do as I say, not as I do kind of situation, where you come into a system that is broken, but rather than try and say, okay, fine, how do we change? You say, you know what, for me, it's a survival tactic. If I want to continue whatever, let me just go with the flow and then leave the next problem to the person who's going to come after me, whatever the case may be. So I need to remove my cynicism slightly.
Do it a little bit.
The aspect of Pan-Africanism. There is an aspect of Pan-Africanism that we do actually have at the moment, and it sits within the realm of music. Right? You can always tell Pan-Africanism in terms of music, you can always tell African music, It also sits in the form of fashion. A lot of people try and mimic what African fashion looks like.
Food.
And the other one is not the best one, but we have our memes are, bar none, the best memes ever as an African nation. So that's the positive light on that side in terms of Pan-Africanism.
Something to look forward to. Again, we can only wrap it up so many times. But even as we do,
I'll stop.
There are opportunities for African unity. There are opportunities, but would you, at the very beginning, you can't put pieces to the pie together that are incomplete. So it sounds to me as though we need to get our own pie pieces in order before we put the pie together.
Absolutely. And this is where we get to say charity begins at home. And I believe we have to put our houses in order so that we can all be on the same table. It will be hard, for example, if we are rooting for, let's say, if we are rooting for example, for a single currency as part of the Pan-Africanism, when also access to that $1 or 1 shilling or 50 bob a day is a problem. So we need to fix our houses in order, look at the issues that are already more prominent, that are cutting across poor governance, cost of living. If we can fix those issues, it becomes at the domestic level, it becomes very easy for people to have an appetite for looking at the bigger picture. Yeah.
Indeed.
I like that answer.
Absolutely.
That's why you should be sitting that youth representation. That seat. It's waiting for you.
These are the conversations that we have on Panel 54. Thank you so much for, joining us in this, Winnie. It's been great to hear your insights and looking forward to those insights being part of the greater conversation as we have.
Yeah, thank you, Du. And that's how we do it here on Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. Now, if anything here that you heard made you pause, reflect, or reframe, please do share it, start the conversation, and don't forget to tag us in. You can find us on your social media platform at Panel 54 Pod or on your favorite streaming website. And don't forget to subscribe. You never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember to keep the lens clear. That's Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens.